So I'll give you a minute to just think about what your recipe is and think about these hands on the dough as we just join in a moment of prayer before our reflection time together. Creator, be with us during this time and this service as we consider your words and our thoughts and meditations, and may only truth be spoken and only truth be heard. In your name, amen. So I want you to think about what happens when bread is first released from the oven. What would hit you first? Would it be the smell, that gorgeous, warm, yeasty scent that calls out for a serving with a generous amount of butter? Or maybe it's the touch, that crusty outside, but the perfect softness of the inside that satisfies the mouth. For some of us, maybe it's the taste. You might say it's like manna from heaven, warm and comforting and filling and sustaining. It's no wonder to me that bread is used often in the Bible as an image for our faith, likening Jesus and his love to the sustaining bread that we need in our lives. Slide. So this week in the text, the crowd has met him, but they don't totally understand what they've just seen. It's another time where we see an everyday, regular moment turned into a powerful insight, an ordinary miracle. What the passage is getting at is that somehow Jesus was able to turn from his intentions to nourish thousands of people with a simple offering of food. A day that should not have had enough suddenly did have enough. And whether or not we can truly see how that kind of process would have worked on that day, we've seen these types of everyday miracles happen in our lives too. The fact of the matter is, Jesus had a message that was guaranteed by his maker. His energy, his message, his teaching, his love and quest for justice are miracles, but also ordinary, as basic as bread to us and integral to life itself. So the disciples must have been wondering and a bit perplexed, what are we supposed to do and learn from this event? What is the work of God for us? How do we pull off these miracles ourselves? And instead the answer is, you've got this sustaining force, you've got this bread in your life. You don't need to worry about getting Jesus. Jesus has got you. And the image of bread is important because we regularly know the physical stomach kind of hunger that can happen in everyday life. But we also know about other kinds of hunger. And we can see that Jesus here is pointing at a notion of God with other imagery we can relate to, that God can be and God's love can be as everyday and regular as bread, also as essential and craved. And it doesn't just stand alone, does it? Bread needs a recipe and a maker and a process and a balance that must be achieved if we're willing to see it through. And if you've ever baked, as I have, you'll know that mistakes can happen along the way. And we need to practice with a mix of ingredients to see if we can have that miracle of a good enough loaf to occur. And take time to see mystery in the steps as the recipe of life unfolds, not waiting for firework and magic, just finding moments of everyday goodness of spirit, placing goodness and possibility in our path. And I'm sure through COVID and the everyday, perhaps we've all had these moments of manna from heaven, times when more was needed and more seemed impossible, but yet somehow in the most unlikely of ways, more was found. Signs that we are part of a wider community. Signs or a signal that somebody cares, that people are playing their part and sharing gifts to see us through in this world. And all we know is we must come together to find ways to walk one another home. And so I take us back to all the times now we've experienced these lockdowns and what we saw in our neighborhoods when those took effect. Simple acts like sharing bread as a gesture when there was nothing else we could do. More than its parts or its recipe, none of those parts really matter, but the folding and the rising and the baking and the eating, the whole process can become like a prayer, and the gifting was like a vow. It was a call to remind us that we never have to go far to find this everyday loving and sustaining force. So what's the recipe for the kindness and the respect and fairness we long for in this life, that we want to see multiplied, just like that day when the crowd gathered and was hungry and were fed against all odds? I'd like to think it's already here, that we have to be mindful of our own ingredients and pay attention to our part in the recipe. And maybe you've heard about the parable of the man and the flood, one of those quick stories that helps us illustrate and remember a spiritual lesson. So it describes a faithful person who's stuck on his roof in a flood, and rescuer after rescuer shows up to help. Someone comes in a boat, someone comes in a car, people eventually come in helicopters and offer to help. And each time he says, "No, thanks, I'm praying to God, and God will save me. I have faith." But as COVID-19 and other scares and tragedies in our lives affect us, we may keep our faith, and we may also rely on our wisdom and kindness that we've been blessed with for the everyday miracles and the gestures that can sustain us. But I'd like to think the forces available to us are that emergency rescue, people and spirit in our lives being the car and the motorboat and the helicopter that attempt to rescue us off that roof. Those helpers and those small moments of grace can be part of our recipe. Slide. So because I was thinking a lot about bread for this image, I wanted to break it down into the basic parts. And bread is a very straightforward list of ingredients. And you'll probably know that flour is a pretty important part of it. And I did a little research into what the flour is for, and basically it's the structure. So if you're looking into the food science part of it, we need the proteins to interact with each other and all the other ingredients to form that gluten. And you need gluten because it's elastic, and it's a framework that stretches to contain the leavening gases during the rising. The protein creates the strength. So to me, it's those people that weren't sure of their role or sure of the significance of their role before a crisis happens. But think about the strength of people that we have in our networks, those public health workers, the tech support people making vaccination registries, decision makers, even when they make their mistakes. To me, the flower are those people who tirelessly interpret trends, keep us updated, post signs, and sanitize for our protection. And so we remember and taste the goodness of the flour that is part of the recipe of our bread of life. Slide. And you'll notice salt is another simple image and flavor in the Bible that comes up many times. And salt is an important part of the process too. Not only does it add a nice little bit of taste, it also helps to regulate how the yeast activates. And its job is to provide a nice slow and steady rise. So it gives you that nice characteristic bread flavor that your mouth is waiting for. It adds strength to the gluten, and it doesn't allow the carbon to be trapped or expand too quickly. And I feel like we all know this because we do need a few of those slow and steady organizers too, those people who are salt in our lives. Maybe they're the committee members, the ones sorting out the Zoom calls, the physically distant AA meetings to support people, the planners who sort out the phone trees and the card deliveries to keep spirits lifted and keep community nicely connected and organized. Of course we need salt, but not too much. Some of us are gifted to lead at different times, and others are meant to enjoy. So we can't all be coordinators, but we can definitely all enjoy the results. And so we remember and taste the goodness of the salt that is part of our recipe of the bread of life. Slide. I hope you'll notice, if you're church people, that I've used the typical church water pitcher. I don't think you can have a church meal without somebody holding onto one of those and serving out of those. We'll get back to that someday, I promise. There were lots of pictures, but I thought that one's just too perfect. So water, also essential, is a solvent, and its job is to help with the dispersing. So it helps make sure all the salt and the sugar and the yeast do their jobs together. So water is necessary for the yeast to ferment and for the yeast to reproduce, and you get a softer dough instead of a drier dough. So water's job is to maintain the consistency. We need the good fresh water to make a good consistent dough and make the recipe all work together. So to me, those people are the coaches, the leaders, the teachers who keep us grounded and remind us of our spiritual and physical and mental practices that we need to maintain our strength and to grow stronger and to keep the faith. For me, that's been my park workout coach, who sadly has moved online for winter. Maybe it's a yoga instructor. Maybe it's people who organize the deep talks during those parking lot coffee clubs. I was speaking to a friend recently who, before COVID, was one of the younger seniors who led their church discussion groups. And when they moved online, she wanted to continue, but she really felt more comfortable in this stage in the role of being a participant, letting someone else who was more tech savvy to keep the group organized and motivated. And I know, we all know, we feel more physically and mentally and spiritually grounded when we do these exercises in some kind of groups and involve our bodies. And in those small groups, it's also important to have those established rules, the ground rules that help us accept that all people and all bodies are good, that we're aiming for togetherness, and there's no competitive outcome. These practices shouldn't hurt. So whatever the regular practice is, whatever kind of stretching we're doing, I feel like we all need coaches like we need water, because these leaders can use their gifts to multiply ours, like those loaves and fish type miracles. They provide the schedule and a commitment on the calendar to keep us accountable. At least that's what I need. I'm not sure about you. And so we remember and taste the goodness of the water that is part of our recipe of the bread of life. Slide. It is tough to get a picture of yeast up close, but that's what that is. It's very tiny. And you'll see yeast used in the images of faith in the Bible as about how tiny a little element can be that can start the process of growing a faith in yourself and in people around you. So we know that as the bread is mixed and kneaded, there's millions of air bubbles that get trapped and spread throughout the dough. So there's a lot of fancy words and science that happens with the yeast, and that's not my specialty, but the people on the internet tell me that the yeast's job is to metabolize the starch and the sugars in the flour. There's a conversion that happens into alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. Anyway, no matter how that makes sense to you, you need the yeast to make things rise. The bread has to rise. And to me, yeast is like the glitter of the good news that we have from the Bible. It's used a lot in the stories of how we can share our faith with others. And it's just these tiny little bits of goodness that when they act together can do something powerful to help others rise. And those can be small ways and big ways. I had a beautiful example recently of a bit of unexpected yeast in our community. We have cousins who live near here, and they're looking for a really expensive modified van because their one child is living with cerebral palsy. And as he grows, he can't any longer stay in the vehicle that they're using. So they've been doing all the networking and working hard with service clubs to raise money to see their way to this new van, which would cost probably 3 times what any of us would usually pay for such a vehicle. So it's been a long road. And Oliver recently had his birthday, and I saw a post that was so beautiful. Our local construction firm from St. Thomas showed up at their house for his birthday with a birthday card and an even bigger check that boosted their fundraising beyond what they ever could have imagined. A loaves and fishes moment, an epiphany for them, for sure. And so we remember and appreciate the goodness of the yeast that is part of the recipe of the bread of life. Slide. So of course in baking we also need something for lubrication to keep the dough texture nice and help it easy to handle, help it to expand. And I'm told in loaves of bread, oil can help with the slicing process as well. It can help with tenderizing baking items, and it keeps the shelf life longer as it slows down the breakdown process, keeps the bread from getting stale. So oil isn't always needed, but it can make a good loaf better, more pleasing, and last longer. And to me, that's sort of like faith and our spiritual practices and the strength that can come from those. They can make a good life better. And this time of year, I can't help but notice how the Olympics can inspire us in ways that we can't really understand, but there's something beautiful about the gathering and the bodies and the strength and the accomplishment that comes of all this work they've put in together. And one of my favorites this year is watching when the teams from Fiji, when they gather up all these strong, nervous athletes, and they raise their voices together in what's called the Fijian Hymn. It's a haunting tune. And with their Alleluia, you can sense that it improves the texture of their team and their essence and how they can pull together in that match. It makes them stronger together. And so we remember and appreciate the goodness of the oil that is part of the recipe of our bread of life. And we can't have baking and we can't have bread without some kind of spice. So this topic is about the spice of life and where we get the variety and scent and flavor and interest. And to me, that can come from our cultural heritage and our influences from family or travel or interests, the flavors of where we live now or where we've been before. Some call that the terroir, the taste of the area that we're in. And we can't forget, even in these dark times, that there are moments of good news and surprises and silver linings that remind us that every day may not be good, but we can find something good in most days. And for me this week, it was just seeing these lovely posts on the internet and stories about folks who know the craft of making the perfectly flavored dumplings to celebrate the Lunar New Year. And the tradition is to make these and distribute them to your neighbors. And pictures of others who are then gifted with these lovely treats, flavored with the exquisite blend of Asian spices. And built into the exchange is this idea of the willingness of people in neighborhoods to be good neighbors to one another and celebrate each other's cultures, even while we're trying to keep our distance. These little moments of simple generosity and breaking bread differently, to me, are loaf and fishes moments that remind us that Spirit is with us. And we'll get through this season together. And so we remember the spice and the flavor we need in these days, and it's all part of the recipe of the bread of life. And the last slide. It's just a happy slide about bread. So I'd like us to think about the fact that we do have a recipe provided us in our faith journey, and sometimes we just have to notice and find the right mixture and follow the steps. Keep our eyes and hearts open to those in our path who might be part of our recipe, sharing the burdens and multiplying the blessings. So if we're looking for a rescue from a rooftop, or just looking for a reminder of that forgiving, patient, insistent love that's available to us and can multiply before our eyes, maybe we already have that recipe. It may not always be balanced, and it might be a bit lumpy sometimes, and we might need to practice to notice, to taste and see what is good around us. But I feel like the ingredients are there. We have flour for structure, just the right amount of salt to regulate, water for consistency, yeast that inspires that rising up, oil to smooth the way, and spice to add the flavor and spark to life. It's like an epiphany in the form of a loaf of bread. So as we reflect this week, I hope you'll notice the ingredients in your life's recipe and adjust as necessary to find that perfect balance, and also always give thanks for the bread of life. May it be so.